Hi there, and welcome to Season 3 of the Humans and AI podcast. In this podcast, we dive into the real-life stories of the top leaders and entrepreneurs within the artificial intelligence, high-performance computing and data center space. These people truly are at the top of their game. We've got honest and authentic conversations with our guests. We're going to chat about their career journeys, the highs and the lows, and even the lessons they've learned from their mistakes, and the victories they've celebrated along the way. It's all about sharing their experience and knowledge. We talk about the company they're currently in and how they see the future of the space. So if you're looking for practical advice from people who have walked the same path, or just a little inspiration, you're in the right place. We're going to be releasing new episodes on Thursday at 12, so make sure you stay tuned.
Hi Zelda, great to have you on. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. Thanks for having me. How are you?
Yeah, very good. Thanks, very good indeed. Well, look, thanks for coming on, and thanks for doing it so soon after your holiday. For the benefit of everybody else, do you mind just doing a bit of an intro as to who you are, your role, and the company you work at?
Of course. So I'm Zelda Mariet. I'm VP of Research at Bioptimus, a startup which is based in France that builds foundation models, so AI models, for biology. The really long and short of it, if you're familiar with things like ChatGPT, right? These large foundation models, they're quite expensive to train, that are typically trained on things like human language, text, and human images, what we call natural images. We're doing the equivalent, but we're training them on the language of life. So we're training them on DNA sequences, on protein structures, on images of biopsies, and so on and so forth, with the goal of building tools that can aid the research and the practice of medicine and biology.
Fantastic. Well, we'll go right into more detail for everybody later on, but it's just great to get to know you a little bit more, Zelda. So obviously, you're one of the co-founders, one of six, which we'll talk about in a minute. But obviously, you have a really successful career before joining. So do you want to take us back to sort of some of those important moments?
Sure, thank you. I've never described myself as successful. It just feels like I still feel like I'm fresh out of grad school somehow. So I was born and raised in France, but I left for the United States in 2014 for graduate school. I really wanted to study machine learning, and it really felt like the United States was the best place to do that. So I went to MIT and did a PhD focused on really like the mathematical underpinnings of machine learning. A lot of polynomial theory for some reason during my PhD. And then fresh out of my PhD, I joined what was then Google Research, and then I was put into Google DeepMind. But I joined Google Research to focus on doing the analysis of how we can model uncertainty in machine learning. We use machine learning or AI more and more today for so many different tasks, but it's really important to understand when you can trust a model's prediction versus when you cannot. And so that's kind of what I was hired to work on. And as part of that, I actually joined what was, 20% team, trying to understand how we could use machine learning models and their uncertainty to do protein design. So going from what for me was, a very theoretical background where all of the data I worked with was pristine because I tended to actually just generate it myself, to working with medical data, which has a lot of really interesting things about it, but I would not necessarily call it very clean. So it was definitely a challenge, but it was genuinely fascinating to just deploy machine learning models that work so well on these benchmark tasks that us academics love to look at, and see them just immediately run into the wall of the noise that exists in data that is actually generated by the real world instead of, what us as computer scientists imagine the real world to be. So that turned out to me, it was really fascinating, right? It was a really interesting challenge. And so I became more and more involved in using AI for biology. Actually, one of the first real projects I work on was designing potential treatments for COVID, because I joined Google DeepMind in 2019, which was right on time for us to all suddenly care about the pandemic. And right as that project was kind of concluding, I think the rest of the AI world pivoted pretty strongly towards what we call large language models. So things like ChatGPT and Gemini and so on and so forth, but really a technology that had been in the background, I think, for a lot of people that all of a sudden became monumentally important. And when people who were thinking of starting Bioptimus, the startup where I'm now at, reached out to me and said they actually wanted to use that technology. They wanted to use those large language models, but not use them on what we call natural language, so human language. They wanted to use them on biological language. To me, that was such a fascinating opportunity that I made the jump from DeepMind to Bioptimus,
I mean,
technically in the very last days of 2023.
2023. I mean that's a big jump because obviously, like I say, relatively early in career, gone to Google during a crazy time, with COVID-19. It was weird for many. I mean, how did you find sort of working for a big machine like Google, doing some fascinating projects, but doing it when the whole world was quite frankly going bananas because it was a crazy time. But I think for you doing the type of work that you were doing. Sounds a bit more poignant than it would be for others.
Well, let me think. First of all, it's really, you're calling Google a big machine, and it definitely is, especially now that I see it from the perspective of a startup. But I was in Google Research, which was, kind of a specific beast
Yep.
within Google, where there was like a lot of academic freedom. A lot of the milestones depended on publishing and, like outreach and sharing the knowledge that we were building with other academics. So it was a separate kind of machine,
Yeah.
I think, in a little bit. And I think one of the really amazing things there was the opportunity when, COVID-19 started. And it's not unique to Google. I know other places have done that as well. But, like sub teams that kind of created themselves to try and contribute how they could to this global crisis. I know people who joined teams or who helped create teams that were thinking about understanding, the mechanisms of disease propagation, for example, early detection, and so on and so forth. It was it was a stressful time. It was weird. We were all working from home, all of that. But I think we were very lucky to have that opportunity as well.
I mean, yeah, it certainly was. It's certainly changed the landscape for many. I don't think we can go back to pre-COVID-19, quite frankly. So,
Yeah, I don't think so either.
It's very, very different. Although, as an example, I'm sat in an office today, so never worked from home a day in my life until after COVID. So very, very strange. But so obviously you then joined obviously Bioptimus. You went from working there. Probably wasn't necessarily thinking about doing a startup until that opportunity presented itself. What was it that was so good about this that just meant you're going to have to leave Google, where a lot of people think that's the end goal, to go to something like this?
Well, I think as for all of these things, there were just a lot of circumstances that came together at the right time. My family is based in France. I was kind of thinking in the background that I was interested in looking for opportunities that would bring me back closer to my family. I did not start my career thinking about machine learning for biology, but I become so interested in it. And obviously, Google's position in biology cannot be overstated. I mean, with the recent chemistry Nobel Prize of AlphaFold, right? Like Google DeepMind's contribution there have been incredible, but it's not the main focus, right? When you're at Google and you say you work on biology, there's a large sub team that's going to care about that. But I really wanted to be, at the center of it, and I think there was a little bit of, that's never going to be as possible at DeepMind as it would be in, a company, whether new or existing, whose goal has always been to understand biology. Then there was the scientific challenge of it. I think everybody was so excited, everybody still is so excited about language models and chatbots and so on and so forth. I mean, I was working on them as well, but this is a personal opinion, and it's depending on how you take it, could be a little bit of a hot take. But I think a lot of when you do language models for natural language, it is very, very difficult to evaluate them. It is very difficult to scientifically say one is better than the other. It's an active area of research. It's very complicated. People have made incredible leaps in these questions, but a lot of it in the day-to-day to me felt very, you think you're doing better, but it's really hard to quantify it. Working in biology is the opposite of that. It is so quantifiable, but quantifying things is extremely expensive And honestly, half of the time when you quantify it, you kind of wish you hadn't because the results are so hard to actually get. But moving, from that less structured area of research to a place where it's much more concrete in terms of understanding whether or not you've made progress, whether or not the decision you made was the right one, was extremely tempting as an opportunity.
Right, sure. And so thinking about it now, so obviously large language models is huge. Everyone's talking about it. You've got companies investing millions and millions and billions in some cases, on the infrastructure to enable large language models. A lot of our customers, things like ChatGPT, as you mentioned, and all the others that are popping up all the time. They're I don't want to say they're more general, they're for everyday uses. I mean, what's the difference between obviously what you guys are doing that's very, very specific then, within sort of the biology world, and how do you sort of separate the two?
Let me think. I'd say that there are two categories of differences. One category is really, the hardcore AI, how you code them, how you build them, like the science that underlies them. And the second difference is how you use them. I'm going to start with the latter because it's like the first part is going to take a little bit of scientific jargon, so I'm going to ease you into it. In terms of how it's used, I think, as you were saying, right, like chatbots and language models on natural language are used by a layperson, and they're for everyday use, right? You use them to rephrase your emails, to translate something, to, have assistance online because you can't get your SIM card to activate. This is a very real scenario from my past week. But they're really used for day-to-day chores, right? What we're building at Bioptimus are models that are the exact opposite of that. They're meant to be used by a small subset of people, typically researchers, biologists, potentially eventually clinicians, but not today, so that they can accelerate medical and biomedical discoveries. So these are models that are going to look at things like a biopsy and output numbers such as, like the probability of the disease progressing under specific types of treatment. Or going to output things like, actually, if you zoom in on this cell, we see that there's a gene that's overexpressed compared to a healthy patient. This is the kind of information that is not, even speaking as myself, I have a hard time understanding what it means because you need such a very strong scientific background to actually parse that output. These are the kind of tools we're building. The users are going to be researchers, they're going to be biologists, they're going to be people with like a very, very strong background in things like drug discovery, patient treatment, and so on and so forth.
Crikey. And you just announced a new model I think it was in April time, wasn't it? I think I saw around pathology, wasn't it, specifically for that?
Yes. So we've released at this point 2 models in computational pathology. They're called H-Optimus 0 and H-Optimus 1. The H stands for histopathology, and the Optimus, I think, is self-explanatory. And indeed, so these are 2 models. The H-Optimus 1 is a little bit more quite a bit more powerful, actually, I should say, than H-Optimus 0, trained on more data. And so this is a foundation model that ingested during training. It's seen a lot of slides. So we call them H&E stained slides of biopsies of cancer patients, typically. And you can use them to do things like predicting the stage, like the disease stage of a patient, which kind of disease they have, which subvariant they have. One of the most exciting applications I've seen so far is actually going to be saying for each, I'm simplifying, but for each location on the slide, so for this, like small image of a tissue that is cancerous, predict whether or not a gene is expressed in specific cells in that image, which is essentially, that's what we're trying to do at Bioptimus is connect the different scales of biology, and this is the first step of it. You're looking at something that is close to the macroscopic. It is, like a small section of tissue, and predicting something that is at the microscopic, which is like, well, in this tissue, you see, thousands and thousands of genes, and in this thousands and thousands of cells, in this cell, here are the genes that are actually being expressed. Something that typically is done not with H&E slides with biopsies at all. Typically, it's done by doing, an analysis, what's called a single cell analysis of the tissue, whereas we're doing it with an image. we're looking at the image, we're having a model look at the image and it tells us, here's what we're seeing. So these are the kind of things that our models do. And so you were asking about H-Optimus, the models, and so we just announced H-Optimus 1 recently, indeed.
And so you've obviously got this model, and then I guess doctors in public and private hospitals all over the world could have access to this potentially.
Yes.
I imagine, obviously with AI as well, it's highly regulated. There's also sort of an ethical element to these things as well.
Absolutely.
How do you sort of navigate that when looking at taking a product like this to market?
That is an excellent question. The first thing I actually want to say, which is, it's important to me, so I'm going to mention it because you gave me a little bit of an opportunity to slide that in here. H-Optimus 0 is fully open source, so it can actually be used by anybody on the market or an academic. And H-Optimus 1, which is a paying model, is actually still completely free to use for academics. So when we are bringing it to the market, but we're also making it freely available for academic research as well, which is a little bit of I would argue, an interesting strategy. Important to me as someone who's still really closely tied to the academic world as well. In terms of regulations, the models we're putting out on the market, and we're not the only ones putting out computational pathology models. There is a whole slew of them online. That's actually why we started there. It makes a good frame of reference for us to gauge how well we're doing. But for all of the people who are putting online computational pathology models, the decisions that are what needs to be regulated, and I'm not an expert on the regulation, so please take everything I'm saying with a grain of skepticism. But what needs to be regulated is the process used to make decisions, either based on a model or based on an expert or based, I don't know, whatever mechanism you have for using decisions. Maybe you're really into astrology, I don't know. Right? But that's what needs to be regulated, is how you're making decisions based on the predictions. And so when you actually see regulation coming for these types of models, it's typically baked in to understanding how they've been analyzed, how they've been benchmarked, and how and under which conditions they're being used. As part of these benchmarks, you were saying, there are a lot of things that need to be regulated, and one of them is how well they perform across the vast spectrum of humanity. There are other things, but this is the most, I don't want to say obvious, but present in the mind of most people who do the regulations, but also the people who train the models. And I'm not going to go on an extremely long rant about this, even though it is near and dear to my heart. A lot of my PhD was actually about how to measure diversity in terms of benchmarking machine learning performance. So I have thoughts on the topic.
Yep.
But what I will say is that if nothing else, one thing is extremely important when you train these machine learning models, or when you draw any kind of scientific conclusion, regardless of whether or not you use AI, is making sure that the data you train on and evaluate on is diverse. This means, for example, having patients from all across the world, different ages, different types of disease, very prosaically different organs, right? The data sets tend to be organ specific, for example, and you don't want to draw predictions for, kidneys if you've only trained on the lung, right? These kind of things. These are all things that are extremely important. And again, I can only use this opportunity to plug this as well, but H-Optimus 1, our most recent model, is, to the extent of our knowledge, been trained on the most diverse patient data set available.
Okay, so, and that's obviously one of the not necessarily selling points, because like I say, it's open to everybody, but for the reason why they would look at this is because of that sort of diverse range of data sets. So
yes.
In terms of obviously your role within the organisation, then as a VP of research, are you able to just sort of talk us through exactly that role and how that sort of contributes to these sort of products and services?
I can definitely try my best. So as VP of research, I'm one of the leads of the research team. We also have a VP of AI. Don't ask us how we split those two titles between us. And it means that we are kind of involved, from the very close to the data aspects of our job. What kind of data do we want to acquire? How do we do quality control on the data? How do we want to use the data? Which technologies do we want to invest in? Because there's a lot of moving parts in, what we call wet lab technologies, the technologies that actually measure the genes within a cell, the technology to actually like produce the H&E slides we look at. So we make a lot of decisions there, or at least we guide our team in helping us make those decisions. And then there's also the pure machine learning aspect of things, which is where I'm more comfortable at. That's where my training comes from, but I'm really trying to build a stronger baseline in terms of data as well. But, you know, how do we bake in assumptions about the data into the model? One thing I didn't get to earlier, right? I said there were these two parts, how you use the model and then the technical aspects of how you build them. That is one of the things that is a major part of my job. How do you think about what is specific about biological data that you want to reflect within the model? To give you a really simple example, I think it's really simple. It's been used before. Is when people came up with convolutional neural networks, or CNNs. These are the neural networks that were the big thing before language models. These CNNs actually use a mechanism, like part of how they pass information through the model was inspired by how human vision works. I'm not going to go into the details because, first of all, I won't do it justice and I might say something wrong. But fundamentally, it was inspired by the fact that these CNNs were built to look at image data. And so the scientists who developed them looked and said, well, we see things as human beings, and we see things using a very specific set of operations that take place in the optic nerve and in the brain. And so they took those operations and said, let's figure out how we can encourage the machine learning models to do the same thing. And we ended up with a technology that was, state of the art for computer vision for a very, very long time. At Bioptimus, we want to do something that's equivalent, except we're not looking at images of cats and dogs and, so on and so forth. We're looking at cancer. We're looking at single cell data. We're looking at DNA sequences. How do we build the equivalent of those patterns within our model? And that means doing a lot of connections between what biologists know about all of these different scales of life and how you could actually look into implementing them from a machine learning perspective. And then it becomes really tricky because implementing them is one thing, but they need to be extremely efficient because foundation models take so long to train. They consume so much data. You can't afford to have something that, works in theory, but in practice takes, 1 second to pass through the GPU.
Yep. So, and before you, when you started this question, you talked about your role and the fact there was a VP of AI, right? So, and that was something we mentioned, before we went on to the show. So, you've got 6 co-founders. Was 6.
So we actually have 7.
You now have 7. How does that work? I've seen 2 co-founders. I've even seen 3. So this is unique. So a true democracy, so to speak, in the fact that you're all there together. But how do you actually run a business when there's 7 of you?
So first of all, I don't know how well I can answer this question because this is the only startup I've been in. So the only startup I've ever known has this many co-founders. To me, that's the baseline.
Okay.
Me,
so the next one, you're going to get 8.
We're going to double every time, right? Yeah. But I think it works quite well. Again, I really don't have a point of comparison, but I would say that we're doing something that's still quite unique, I would say, in the world of startups, because we're really combining 2 separate worlds. We have the world of AI, and then we have the world of biology, and our teams are actually really built to reflect that. We have as much knowledge in one and in the other, and we really try to hire people who already have a blend of those 2 as well, because we want all of the aspects of knowledge to talk to each other. But someone who has, that is an incredibly specific skill set, and it's extremely rare to have so many of them combined at the same time. Having our diverse set of co-founders actually really helps us in, making decisions and understanding how to hire, where to focus on, from opportunities to data acquisition as well, because we have experts on single cell. We have our most recent co-founder, Charlie Saya, is an expert in computational pathology, for example. We need that kind of knowledge in the room when we make these decisions. I come in with a lot of opinions on machine learning and, like GPU usage and scaling and benchmarking for language models, right? But on my own, I'm not going to take us far enough. We really need that variety of skill sets.
And so that's probably one of your sort of superpowers, is the fact that you've got all these people, at the top table that come from different sides of the business to help drive you forward.
I do think so.
Mm-hmm.
And I think like kind of implicit in the question you're asking, as well as, getting that many people in a room, how do we actually manage to make decisions? We're all going to have different opinions, want to do different things.
It's not short
again,
straw, is it?
We actually have a boxing ring.
That would be good.
So, our co-founder numbers is going to start going down, right? That's why we started so high. No, joke aside, our team has, I don't know how to describe this in a way that doesn't sound trite. Everybody says their team has a good culture. So I'm going to say our team has a good culture, but it's really, I have heard it said by other people as well that our team culture is really unique in the way that we're able to make decisions, maybe disagree on what decision needs to be made, but once we've all kind of settled on a decision, all coming together and moving forward. It's true among the leadership. It's true among the people we've hired as well. I think our tech team is absolutely incredible. I'm not just saying that because I was part of the hiring process. I genuinely think it's true. And I think just the culture that we've really tried to instill since the very beginning is why this works.
And then with culture, because obviously, like I say, you've got co-founders, but then you've obviously got people that work within the organisation as well. And yeah, you're right. Everyone tends to say that it's a good culture, but I think you're going to say that if you're passionate about the business you work in and if you're proud of the business you work in, right? And I think that's important to have that as a starting block. I mean, in terms of taking the business forward, you've managed to attract some great top talent. So you've recently just announced a new chief commercial officer. You've got a new COO at the end of last year, and they're quite senior individuals, lots of experience. You said yourself, this is your first sort of startup. So what's the sort of thinking behind bringing in other senior leadership within the organisation?
Well, I would say that our initial team of co-founders is very technical. Most of us, quite a few of us actually come from Google DeepMind. There are 3 of us initially from Google DeepMind. And then all of us have a very strong technical background. That, I think, did a really good job getting us off the ground. When there were only 4 of us full-time, we released Optimus 0, which, in retrospect, I'm still impressed we managed to pull that off. It was a lot of all-nighters, but, it's a really good model. But it's not going to work in the long term, right? We've had 2 very successful fundraisers, but we need to put products on the market. We need to be able to understand how to market them, what our product strategy should be. And I'm definitely going to have opinions about all of these things, but they're not going to be educated opinions. And I don't know that I should actually have that much of a say in those types of questions. And so that's part of why we've been expanding in, these more, like, I want to say less technical in the sense that we're not hiring people who are actively training the model and, like staring at loss curves and, hoping they go down, because that's not the only skill set we need. We started out with this team, with a very technical team, put together a proof that we were a team that were capable to, execute really, really fast and build good science. That's not the only step. The next step is really actually building products for customers. And again, not my area of expertise, so I'm less comfortable talking about this than like attention mechanisms. But we can't just build a tech, right? We also have to build a community around the technology that we're building. What we're doing is very new. One thing I haven't really talked about too much is the fact that we're not building AI models for a specific zone of biology. We're not just building them for biopsies. We're not just building them for single cell. We're not just building them for DNA. We want them to all talk to each other. We want the model for DNA to inform the decisions that are made for the model for proteins, that informs the decisions that are made for cells, and so on and so forth. We have this, like Russian doll nested structure because biology has this Russian doll nested structure. But this is quite new. No one has really put together a model on the market that does this yet. And we believe that it's going to be incredibly successful, but we do need to actually build a community around this as well. And as much as I'd say the tech team is going to do a pretty good job at building an academic community around this, hopefully, that's not going to be enough. We need to be revenue positive. We need to put products out on the market. We need to understand who will use these, how we can convince pharma, for example, to leverage these models and put them into their R&D systems. We need to hire people who actually have those skill sets.
I think that's probably one of the best things, isn't it? Is when you can recognise your own strengths and then obviously recognise the gaps to create that business to take it forward. And you mentioned community, because obviously it's quite interesting. A lot of businesses, that we're hearing more about community now. Whether it be creating sort of developer relations and getting the developer ecosystem, and businesses trying to get that off the ground. And we're now hearing customers talk about community as in from a sales perspective. So, looking at channel partners and direct customer base and calling it a community rather than a target customer. And it's it's definitely sort of changed a little bit. And I think it's probably more respective of the actual value of the relationship that builds, as opposed to just trying to actually generate revenue out of one target organization. So I think the dynamic's changing. I think it definitely is.
Again, I'm too new at this to have seen the dynamic progress, but I definitely think that it is community oriented in ways that speak to me, at least, because academically, that's how you get an idea out. You get other people to use it, you get other people invested in it, and then they're going to build upon it, reuse it, find flaws, update it, change it. And that's how ideas get traction. And I'm seeing a lot of that today as well in the business world that I intersect with.
So, and then so obviously you're making these key hires that are going to help take the business forward. What does the future look like then, really? Because obviously it's a very young startup business. You mentioned that you've had some investment. Obviously, most recent investment I think was in January of this year. Not a small amount of money came into the business. So the plan is to grow. Where do you see the next sort of 12, 18 months, sort of 2 years going for you guys?
Sorry, you can't. The people listening can't see this, but I'm laughing because this is one of those questions that comes up in all of our regular meetings as well. So if I had an obvious answer to give you, it would make all the rest of my meetings also much easier. But we're going to continue growing the tech team. That's kind of where I come in and where I see where we, need to build. Either we have gaps in our knowledge. I think we've managed to really do all of the key hires there. That being said, we're still a small team and I don't want anybody to be overworked. So we kind of want to grow the team so we have more ability to not rely too much on the same person who has this extremely specific type of knowledge that we need. That being said, we're also going to be growing a lot outside of the tech team. That's a little bit a question for these other people you mentioned, Matilda Strong, our COO, Julie Girardi, our CCO, who are going to build the hiring strategy there. But those teams, now that we have the person in charge of the teams, now the teams are definitely going to grow.
So it's about growing the business and then obviously the custom base. And you mentioned earlier on that obviously a lot of what your products and services are open source, so free to use. Just understanding your commercial model, and I appreciate you're on the technical side, so don't worry. How do you take that business? Yeah, how do you actually start monetizing? Obviously, you've got investors, all those kind of things. What's the sort of next stage for the business?
So, indeed, we do have our models that are open source, and even our latest model is available for free to the academic community. And that's actually going back to what we were just saying about community. Because if academics, PhD students use their models and find that they work well, they're not going to be PhD students forever. They're going to graduate. Some of them are going to stay in academia. Some of them are going to go to the industry. And once we have people, in the labs who are saying, hey, we need to make these types of decisions, and we've used this. We've used Bioptimus. We know it works well. We've benchmarked it extensively as graduate students. That's a way in to a market in a world that is understandably difficult to get into, right? Medical applications are, as we have discussed before, extremely regulated. The decisions that you make have really wide-ranging consequences, not just talking about, putting a drug on the market because we exist a little bit before that, But if you commit to a strategy, if you commit to designing drugs for a specific target, that is a multi-million-dollar investment that, is going to take years before you know if it actually is going to pan out or not. So understandably, people can be quite hesitant going in. And so part of our strategy is actually getting the people, from like the very early stages to using our models, to seeing their value without putting a price for them to join the community, in a sense. I'd say we've achieved that. So I'd say we've done a pretty good job of that. I don't know the most recent numbers for the number of downloads for our model, but for a computational pathology model, I think the recent one has 60K downloads this month. I don't know how often you use a histopathology model, but at home, outside of my working hours, I don't think I've ever downloaded one. The next step, though, is commercialization, right? It is actually obtaining revenue. We have two strategies. The one is, the very straightforward continuation of what I just said. It's going to be, specific licenses for tech companies or pharma who want to use our models and, for various applications, right? So it can be tech companies who are actually building tools like hardware, for example, to gather data, that want to use our models like Optimus to make a decision about which areas to focus in on. I'm going to give a really broad, incorrect metaphor, but just for the purpose of this conversation, let's say that you've measured, you have a biopsy, and you're trying to figure out where you want to get like super resolution. It could be that you're going to say, well, I want to use Optimus to figure out which are the areas of interest, and then I'm going to measure really, really precisely within that sublocation, right? So you could say there we have, like kind of a data generation mechanism where people are either going to be using our model and paying for it because they want to, get the best decision making inside of the hardware that they're building, or alternatively, a data flywheel where they're using our model, produce data, and in exchange we get some access to the data to build more models, to have more modalities. Modality means different types of data. So we wouldn't only have, like biopsies, but we might have, these super resolution, like subcellular information about the tissue and so on and so forth. That's the first one. That's the obvious, we're commercializing our models ourselves. And then the second one, which is also not going to be a huge surprise, but, looking at partnerships with, for example, pharma as well, for, early stage pilots and then longer term commitments to jointly develop bespoke technologies, or focusing on specific targets.
Fantastic. So you can have two routes to market then, essentially. So grow the teams, and then obviously create that sort of revenue stream over the next sort of 12 months, 2 years, that kind of thing.
Yes.
So
you're saying grow the team then? It's a little bit more of a simultaneous endeavor.
Simultaneous.
We're going to get better at the commercialization as our team grows.
Well, now you've got a new chief commercial officer. That stands to reason that's going to help. So you're bringing in the right skills. So before we sort of finish up, one of the things that is amazing is like you early in your career have gone into entrepreneurship and built a business, and there's obviously 6 of you, which is great. In terms of obviously other people, 6 then 7. Obviously, there's lots of other people that are thinking about doing that now, right? So, whether in academia, whether they're just working for a tech firm with a great idea, what sort of advice would you give somebody that is basically, where you were just sort of, a couple of years ago, right? So, looking at making that sort of leap, what advice would you give them? You've learned a lot. You've made probably many mistakes. That's how we learn. But how would you sort of help make that journey a little bit, more pain-free for someone?
I think if I were to give one piece of advice, it's a little bit of a cheat, but do it with somebody who fills in the knowledge gaps that you have, right? Like we have, as part of our team, our CEO, our general manager have knowledge. They're part of the co-founding team as well. Knowledge that I never developed. They've, been in like really high positions in previous startups. They've actually built, they have like the first fundraise, they did all of the work, right? I mean, they're still doing they still did most of the work for the second fundraise, don't get me wrong. But, I came in knowing nothing about the world of VCs and fundraising. And that was great because I could rely on someone else to do that, and I could just focus on, like Optimus Zero. So I don't. It feels like it feels like a fake answer a little bit, but having a really good co-founder, having really good co-founders, 5 or 6 or 7 of them go crazy, it makes it so much easier to do a task that's so complicated and has so many points of failure when you can rely on other people for their knowledge, their time, their skill set, their connections.
But to be fair, I can understand that. I mean, obviously we have different businesses, but we're a startup as well. I don't have a co-founder, so I don't have other people to brain dump on, learn from in that sort. I mean, obviously I learn from all the team, but when it comes to business strategy decisions, I am responsible for the success and the failure. Like, I don't have any other sort of source of knowledge or information, and it's a lonely place, right? So I think the other thing being is founding a business and starting a business is a very stressful at times job. It's very intimidating, and it can be lonely, but to be sharing it with people, and you all, obviously from the way you're talking, you all bring something different to the party, so there's you all add that value. So I don't think it's a cheat. I mean, maybe it is a cheat, but maybe it's a cheat that everyone should be doing. That's the thing.
I mean, honestly, now I want to ask you a bunch of questions about what it's like, being all alone doing these things, because it must come with a completely different set of challenges.
It's stressful as hell. I mean, I don't mind saying it. I mean, I love it. I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't ever go back to working in another business. I think, because it is so rewarding. I am looking, for bringing in a senior leader into the business, right? That I can sort of, knowledge share and, just, be stressed together, quite frankly.
There's something really important to be said about being stressed together. That it was, I'm not going to say, I'm sure it is more stressful to be the only one, but it has been extremely stressful, like co-founding Bioptimus. But when it gets really stressful, I can text one of my co-founders, like, I'm so stressed, and they're like, I know, right? And just that, it's nice, it helps,
I can imagine. I mean, my wife probably feels like a co-founder because I have to sort of brain dump on her, and sometimes she's just not interested. But it's a big thing. But I think it's something that people underestimate, that it is such a daunting task. Nothing's easy. You talked about all the all-nighters. You do all those kind of things as well, don't you? So I think anybody is starting again. If they can find a co-founder. If they can't find a co-founder, then it's about getting a team in as quickly as possible that can take where you're weak and doing it together, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, look, this has been brilliant. I'm really, really interested to keep watching your journey and seeing what you guys are doing and watching you guys grow, and particularly now you've got all these obviously senior people in your business as well. I think we are looking at getting your colleague on as well later on in the year. So we've all been having those conversations. So, see what happens in 4 months' time. It's a long time, but only a short period of time as well in the world of business. And we'll sort of take it from there. But look, thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me, Nick.
Brilliant. All the best.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. I truly hope you got to take away something valuable. This episode was brought to you by Asobi. I'm the founder and managing director, and it's our goal to connect the very best talent in the most exciting scale-ups in AI, ML, and the DC space. If you're looking for more practical advice or just some inspiration from those that have been there and done it, stay with us. We're going to be releasing new episodes every week, so make sure you subscribe to the podcast and follow Asobi on LinkedIn so you don't miss a thing.